Hello and welcome back to my channel if you are returning. If you are new here, visiting for the first time, thank you so much for stopping by. I'm Anita with Anita by Design, and here on my YouTube channel, you will find step-by-step, very detailed sew-alongs, tutorials, pattern reviews, and other sewing-related content to help you with your projects. Today I have a sew along for you, and I'm so excited about this one because I have actually sewn this dress 4 times. I have fallen in love with it because it's so very comfortable and it is easy to sew. We will be sewing Simplicity 8874, and it is an easy to sew pattern, so it is beginner friendly. So if you are new to sewing and you have basic sewing skills, you should be able to sew this dress. If you have gone through my online sewing course, Learn to Sew, Mastering the Basics, then you have been equipped with all the skills you need to finish this dress. If you have not learned how to sew yet and you're interested, then I invite you to check out my course. There is a link in the description box below where you can go and get all of the details about the course to see what's offered, and you can figure out if it's for you. If you decide that you do want to take the course, make sure that you get on the wait list. The course is sold out right now, so the doors are closed, but I will be opening the course again before the end of the year, and the people who are on the wait list will have the first opportunity to enroll. So go check that out. If you have not already watched the pattern review that I recorded for this pattern, I do recommend that you go and watch that video first. I give you all of the information about the pattern, including fabric suggestions. I show you some of the different types of knits that would be appropriate for sewing this dress. And I also give you some information about the additional supplies that I will be using that are not included in the notions section on the back of the pattern envelope. So click the link in the description box or above up to your right corner and check out the pattern review first and then come back to the sew along. Without further ado, let's jump right into the sew along. Okay, I will be using 3 different machines to sew my dress. But I don't want you to think that you need 3 machines to sew your dress. You only need a regular sewing machine. The reason I'm using 3 different machines is because I just love all of my Baby Lock sewing machines, and I really do use all of them when I'm sewing, and I'm going to show you how I'm using them. Okay, so to sew your dress, you will use your regular sewing machine. Now, if you have a serger, you can actually sew your entire dress using your serger, with the exception of the darts on the bodice. You will need to use your regular machine to sew the darts, but you can sew the rest of the dress, including the hem, with your serger. And if you want to know how you can sew a garment with your serger, then I have a video here on my YouTube channel that shows you exactly how to do that. We sew a full t-shirt, including the hem, with the serger. So you can click on that link in my description box below to learn how to sew a garment with the serger. If you don't have a serger, then you will use your regular sewing machine. So I will be sewing with my Baby Lock Soprano. I am using a 2.5 stitch length and a 0.5 stitch width, and that will give you the amount of stretch that you need to sew this garment. Now, if your machine comes with a built-in stretch stitch, then you can use that also instead of a zigzag stitch. Now, when you get ready to finish off the raw edges of your seam allowances, there are several ways you can do it. First of all, we are using knit fabric, so you don't have to finish off your seam allowances if you don't want to, because knit fabric does not unravel, it does not fray. But if you would like to, I always finish off the seam allowances in my knit garments because I like for the insides of my garments to have that nice, clean, polished look. So I use a serger to finish off my seam allowances. If you don't have a serger, you can do a pinking shear. You can use your pinking shears to finish off your seam allowance, or you can use a zigzag stitch. And after you use a zigzag stitch, you would just trim away the excess fabric outside of that zigzag stitch. Or you can fold your hem allowance in, press it, and then stitch. And I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to give you a little guidance on that during the tutorial. Okay, if you have a serger, then you will easily just serge away your seam allowance. And that's what I will be doing. And I will be using my Baby Lock Vibrant Serger to finish off the seam allowances. Now, to hem my dress and to top stitch around the neck edge, I will be using my new Baby Lock Euphoria cover stitch machine. I absolutely love this machine and how easy it makes the hemming process. Now, of course, if you don't have a cover stitch machine, you can use a twin needle on your regular sewing machine, and you will get a double row of stitching on the top and then the zigzag stitching on the bottom, which will give you the stretch that you need. Okay, so you will see me using all three of these machines, but don't worry, you can use your regular machine to get the same outcome that I will get. All right, so let's move forward. Also, I will be using a walking foot to sew my dress. Whenever I'm working with knit fabrics, especially lightweight, really thin knit fabrics, I use the walking foot because it helps to feed both layers of your fabric through the machine evenly. If you've ever sewn with a knit fabric and when you get to the end of your stitch and one layer is longer or shorter than the other layer, it's because both layers of fabric are not feeding through the machine at the same time. The feed dogs on your machine help to feed the fabric through, but adding a walking foot helps to feed the fabric through better. So while the feed dog is feeding that bottom layer through, the walking foot is helping to feed the top layer of fabric through. So both layers are feeding through evenly. So if you have a walking foot, I do suggest using it. If not, you can use your regular presser foot on your machine. You just want to make sure that you are do a practice stitch with a scrap piece of the fashion fabric that you're going to use to see if your settings are right. You may need to adjust the presser foot pressure to make sure that your fabric is feeding through evenly. Okay, so after you decide which view of the dress you're going to sew, you're going to need to pick out your pattern pieces. So if you are going to sew view A, then you will need pieces 1 through 7. And if you're adding elastic, you will need piece 11. So you need to identify which pieces you will need, cut those out with your fashion fabric, and then we are ready to get started. Okay, we're going to construct the skirt front and skirt back by stitching a seam along the center front and the center back. So I am working on the center back now. So I have one center back piece placed with the right side facing up, and the way you're going to know which piece you're working with is by checking the notches. This has triple notches, so this is my back piece, and you want to make sure that you're working on the correct edge, so look for those notches. So with that piece in place, I'm going to take the other back piece and place it face down on top with the right sides facing. And then we're going to line up those edges, the raw edges, making sure that they're even from bottom to top, and we're going to pin into place. Okay, now that we have the center back seam pinned, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch starting at the hem at the bottom all the way up to the top at the waist. Okay, I have the fabric in place, and because I'm using such a thin, slinky fabric, I like to start in about 1/4 of an inch from the edge on the bottom, just to make sure that my fabric doesn't get sucked down into the feed dogs. And also, I will take my thread tail, the needle thread, and when I start the stitch, I will make sure I'm pulling this thread to the back to also help prevent that fabric from being fed down or pulled down into the feed dogs. And I'll hold on to the fabric for a few stitches and then I'll release it. Okay, and then we're going to continue stitching. And before I get to the very edge, I'm going to back stitch because I don't want to go too close to the edge, because when I back stitch, I don't want to get my fabric down into the feed dogs. Now at this point, it is up to you whether or not you want to leave your seam allowance raw. When you're working with the knit, you don't have to worry about the ends fraying. So it's up to you, but I like to finish off my raw edges, so I'm going to use my serger to finish off the edges. If you want to finish your edges and you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch, you can use your pinking shears, or you can fold over your fabric, and then you will go to your sewing machine and you will sew along the seam allowance only, just to secure that fold, and then you would go back and press it again just to make sure it's flat. And the raw edges are nice and clean. Okay, I have pressed the seam on both sides and I have a nice clean finish now. This is my skirt back. I'm going to do the same thing for the skirt front, and then we're going to pin our pocket pieces to the side of our skirt front and back. So we have 4 pocket pieces and we need to attach those to the front and back of the skirt. So I'm taking a pocket piece and I'm going to place it face down onto the skirt. Let me move this down, and we're going to line up the raw edges of the pocket with the raw edges of the skirt at the side, and then we're going to pin that in place. Okay, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch a 3/8 inch seam from the top down to the edge of the pocket. Now my pocket ends here, so I'm going to keep an eye on that. I'm going to remove my pin. And I'm going to back stitch. Okay, so my pocket is attached and we're going to go to the pressing station and press the pocket out. Okay, we have our pocket attached. I'm going to press the seam flat on both sides. Then we're going to take our pocket and open it out, so with the wrong side facing up. We're going to press the seam toward the pocket. And we're going to turn it over and press it on the other side. Okay, you want to attach all 4 of your pocket pieces following the same steps, and then we're going to stitch our side seams together. Okay, so we're looking at the skirt back piece from the bottom edge, and then here we have our pocket attached. So we're going to lay this out, and then we're going to take our skirt front and we're going to place it on top with the right side facing down. Then we're going to pin that in place. Okay, let's move down and we're going to pin our pocket pieces together. I'm going to make sure you align them all the way around. Okay, so we have our pocket pinned. Now we want to go and pin in this area. So we're going to take our edges where the pockets meet and make sure we line that up. And then we'll pin that in place. And then we'll add another pin in between. You can use as many pins as you'd like for your comfort. Okay, oops, I just lost a pin. Okay, we have our pocket pinned in place. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to the machine and we're gonna sew a stitch from the bottom edge of the skirt all the way up. You should have transferred a mark from your pattern piece onto your skirt at the side seam or at the side edge. And then we're going to back stitch, and then we're going to start again at the second mark, back stitch, and then sew all the way up to the edge. So let's go to the sewing machine. Okay, we're coming up on that marking on the skirt where the pocket is, and I'm going to place a pin so that you can see where my mark is. And I'm going to remove this pin and then continue sewing. Okay, I'm going to back stitch. Okay, now I'm gonna move my fabric down. If you don't have an automatic cutter, you can just remove your fabric, cut it, and then line it up again. So I'm gonna move it down to where that second mark is. And at this point, you wanna make sure that your edges are lined up and that seam is lined up. Okay, so my second mark is here. I'll place a pin so that you can see it. Okay, so I'm gonna line up my needle to hit where that mark is. And I'm gonna lower my needle. And then I'll continue sewing, and I'm going to start with a back stitch. The back stitch. Okay, so we've sewn in the side seam, but now we need to sew around the edge of the pocket. So I'm going to go back to this intersection where we started, or where we did our first back stitching for the pocket opening. I'm going to insert my fabric there. And I'm going to start right at that seam. I'm starting where this seam is, where the marking is on the skirt front at the pocket, aligning it with the 5/8 inch mark. And I'm going to lower my needle. And then I'm just going to sew around the edge of the pocket. Okay. And I'm just using my hand to manipulate the fabric around the curves. And I want to make sure that I'm keeping my raw edges even. Back stitch. Okay, at this point, before you finish off your seam allowance on the side seam of your skirt, you want to clip below your pocket on your skirt back, and you're going to clip from the edge up to but not through your seam. And the reason we do this is so that the pocket can fold over to the front of the skirt without bringing the seam allowance with it. So I am going to clip through both pieces because I want to use my serger to finish off my seam allowance below the pocket. Okay, so again, I will be serging this portion all the way down, and then I will trim away the excess seam allowance on my pocket. I'm not going to serge that because I don't want any extra bulkiness to show through on this fabric because it's really thin. So after clipping below the pocket on the skirt back, then you can finish off your seam allowance however you choose. Okay, after you have finished your side seam in your pocket, if you are serging your side seam, then press that seam allowance to the back, to the skirt back. If you are leaving your seam allowances raw, then just press that seam allowance open. And then for the seam where your pocket is inserted, you want to press that toward the front of your skirt along with your pocket. Okay, now that we have pressed our pocket toward the front, we're going to pin the pocket to the skirt at the waist, and then we're going to baste stitch. So let's just place a couple of pins. Okay, I'm starting my stitch just a little bit past the seam. Okay, our pocket is inserted. Okay, before sewing the hem, I want to stabilize this area to prevent it from stretching. I'm going to be using a knit interfacing, and I've cut 1-inch strips that I'm going to use to fuse onto the wrong side of my hem right along or all the way around the edge of the skirt. So I'm going to just place it, and I intentionally did this after sewing in the seams because I want to fuse this hem down. So I'm just gonna place that right around the edge of the hem, and then I'm gonna fuse that in place. And then I'm gonna mist it, and I'm just using a water bottle. And without using any steam, I'm just going to fuse that in place. And you can just follow the manufacturer's instructions for fusing your interfacing onto your fabric. Okay, so I'm going to continue doing this all the way around my skirt hem using the strips, and once I get to the end of one strip, I'm going to take another one and I'm going to overlap about maybe 1/4 of an inch and then continue. Okay, and then what this is going to do is, first of all, it's going to help to give me a ridge along the edge when I'm folding up my hem, so I don't have to use my seam gauge or anything to measure it off. This strip is 1 inch, so that makes it quick and easy for me to fold it up when I get ready to sew in my hem. And then also it's going to help to prevent the hem of the skirt from stretching when I'm sewing. Okay, and then after you have finished fusing the interfacing to your hem, you're going to fold your hem up along the edge of the interfacing, and then you're going to just press it all the way around the hem of the skirt. And what I really like is that the interfacing gives the hem extra weight, which helps it to hang so beautifully. Okay, and then after you're done with that, you're going to go to the sewing machine and you're going to sew in your hem. Okay, so I'm going to be using my Baby Lock Euphoria cover stitch machine to sew in the hem. You can use a twin needle to sew your hem, and that will give you pretty much the same finish, except I'm using 3 needles for my hem. With your twin needle, of course, you'll only be using 2 needles. So just line up your hem wherever the needles fall along the edge for the hem on the inside. So you want to make sure that your needle is catching this raw edge as you finish off your hem. All right. Okay, I'm going to cut off the thread tail and then continue sewing. And as I come up on the stitching where I began, I need to make sure that I'm aligning the rows of stitching with the notches on my presser foot to make sure that I get a straight line. I'm going to raise my presser foot, and then I'm going to pull the threads forward. If you watched my series where I showed you how to use a cover stitch machine, I showed you how to end stitching on the round. So I pulled the threads toward me, and then you can take anything that will fit underneath your presser foot, and then you're going to pull those threads towards you, and then you will clip the thread, and then just pull your garment from underneath the presser foot, and then those threads will pull through to the back. Okay, and the threads you see here on top are the ones that were there when I started, so I will just go and clip that away. So I have a nice clean stitch. You can't really see it because my thread blends in with my fabric, which is a good thing. So let's take a look at the back side. Let me clip away this thread. And on the back side, I will just tie off the threads. I will tie a knot nice and neat on the back and the front, and then I will go and give it a nice flat press at the pressing station. And then we will do the same thing to hem the sleeves when we finish constructing our bodice. Okay, to construct the bodice of our dress, we're going to start by sewing in the darts on the bodice front. So I have already sewn in 1 dart, so we're going to sew the other one in together. So you should have transferred the dart markings onto your fabric from the pattern tissue. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn this around. We're going to pinch right at the dart tip. We're going to pinch right there and add a pin. And then go down to the end of the dart leg and align the dart leg on both sides by looking at where those lines are. Now, a really quick tip that makes this a lot easier is using a pair of scissors right where those dart legs are. So I'm going to open up and I'm going to clip just at the edge, about 1/8 of an inch in on both sides. And you can actually do this after you trace your darts onto your fabric. And then when we go to line it up, we can use those little clips, the little slits in the fabric, to make sure that we are aligning the dart legs on the end evenly. Okay, and then you can continue pinning along the dart, making sure that you are pinning on the line on both sides. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch from the edge of the dart down to the tip. Okay, and we're going to just stitch right along the line. And right when you reach that tip, you can sew right off the edge, and you're going to raise your presser foot, but don't cut your threads. Raise your presser foot, and then you're going to pull off a length of thread. Then you will knot the threads close to the fabric to prevent the threads from unraveling. Okay, to press our dart, we're going to turn it flat and just give it a burst of steam. Okay, then we're going to take our tailor's hem and we're going to open out the bodice, and we're going to place it onto the hem with the dart tip down toward the curved edge of the tailor's hem. And we're going to make sure that the dart is folded down. Give it a burst of steam. I'm going to turn it over and do the same thing. Proper pressing is so crucial when you're sewing. It really does help to give you a nice, clean, polished finish on your garments. Okay, so we're gonna let that cool, let your dart cool, and then we will move to the next step. Okay, now we're gonna prepare our bodice back starting at the center back seam. So I have one bodice back with the right side facing up. I'm going to take the other bodice back with the right side facing down, and we're going to align the edges at the center back, and then we're going to pin that in place. Making sure that the raw edges are even at the side and at the edge, the bottom edge of the bodice. Okay, after you're done pinning your pieces together, you will go to your sewing machine and sew a stitch from the bottom all the way up to the top. Finish off the raw edges and press your seam allowance. You're going to do that the same way you did with your skirt pieces. Then we're going to come back and we're going to prepare the shoulder area. Okay, I have sewn in and finished my center back seam. Now we're going to work with the shoulder areas. We're going to stabilize the shoulder area so that we don't stretch it out during wear. Especially if you're working with a knit that doesn't have great recovery, you want to make sure that you stabilize this area. So I'm using a piece of stay tape, and we're going to place it onto the shoulder area at the 5/8 inch seam. So I'm going to use my seam gauge, and I have it marked at the 5/8 inch line, and we're just going to place that there to measure down. And then we want to make sure that the stay tape is somewhere on that 5/8 inch seam line. Okay, and then I'm just going to pin that to hold it in place until we're ready. So we're going to bring over our bodice top or bodice front, and we're going to place it with the right side facing up, and then we're going to take the back and we're going to match up our shoulder edges. Making sure that the raw edges are even. We're going to pin that in place, making sure that we're catching in our stay tape. Now, another way that you can do this, which would make it easier, it will be double the work, but it would make it easier so you don't have to hold on and make sure you're not shifting your stay tape, is after you pin your stay tape onto your shoulder on the back, the bodice back, go to your sewing machine and baste that in place. So you can baste it on, and then when you get ready to pin it to the front, you don't have to worry about it shifting. Okay, now that we have that pinned in place, we're going to go to the sewing machine and sew a seam from one edge to the other on both shoulders. And the reason we pin the stay tape to the back bodice piece is because after we're done sewing in the seam and finishing off the raw edges, is we're going to press the seam allowance toward the back bodice piece. That way you won't see the stay tape. Okay, so let's go to the sewing machine. So I have my fabric edge aligned at the 5/8 inch mark, and you can see that my needle is going to fall. I'll turn it down. You can see that the needle is falling onto the stay tape. Okay. Okay, so we have our stay tape in place, our shoulder seam is sewn. So you will finish off your raw edge. If you are using a serger, after you finish off the raw edge, press your seam allowance toward the back. If you are leaving your edges raw, then go to your pressing station and you will press your seam allowance open. Okay, the shoulder seams are done and the seam allowance is pressed toward the back so you can't see the stay tape. Next, we're going to pin the bodice together at the side seams or at the side edges. And you have this flap where your dart is. Just to be safe that it doesn't flip while you're sewing, pin that down. And as I come up on this dart, I'm going to press down on the fabric because I'm using a very slinky fabric. It could pucker as the presser foot starts to go over it and push the dart back this way. So I'm going to press down on my fabric. You may not have to do this with yours, but I'm going to press down just to make sure it's staying flat. And I'm going to leave that pin until just before I reach the pin. Okay, I'm going to remove the pin and continue sewing, and I'm holding on to my dart. I'm pressing down on my dart. Okay, and now I'm past it and I didn't get any puckers. Okay, so we have our side seam sewn in and we have our dart So finish off your raw edge, press your seam allowance toward the back of the bodice, and then do the same thing on the other side. Okay, after we have sewn together the side seams, now we're going to sew our band to attach it to the neckline. So we're gonna grab the strip for the band, and you're gonna take your short ends with the right sides facing, making sure that it's not twisted. Okay, and you're gonna pin your short end together. Then you will go to your sewing machine and insert a stitch from one edge to the other, and then you're going to press your seam allowance open. You're not going to finish off the raw edges if you're using a serger. Okay, I have pressed my seam allowances open. Now we're going to fold our neckband lengthwise, and we're going to press in a fold all the way around the length of the neckband. Okay, now our neckband is ready to be attached to the neckline. Okay, before we pin the neckband to the bodice, we need to find the center front on the bodice. So what we're going to do is take the front and we're going to fold it in half like this, and we're going to match up that curve. We're going to match up that curve and then fold it in half, and then that will be our center front. So I'm going to place a pin there. And when we get ready to attach our neckband, we will know where the center front is. Okay. Now we need to do the same thing with the neckband. We need to find the center front. So the seam that we sewed in on the short end, that's the center back. So we're going to fold that in half, and then we're going to straighten it out. So we're going to insert a pin there so that we will know where our center front is on the band. Okay, so now we're ready to attach the neckband to the bodice. So we're going to bring our bodice back over, and we're going to start on the center back. So taking the seam on the neckband, we're going to align it with the seam on the neckline, the center back seam. And we're going to pin that into place. And I'm going to use a pin on both sides of the seam. Okay, now making sure that the neckband is straight, that it's not twisted. Okay, so I have that neckband laid out to where it's straight and it's not twisted anywhere. So here is the center front. So I'm going to take the center front of the neckband and attach it to the center front of the neckline. Okay, now that we have it attached at the center front and the center back, we can go around the entire neckline and attach the band, because we know at this point that our neckband is straight, it's not twisted. You will notice as you're pinning that the neckline is longer than the neck band. It's supposed to be that way. What you will do is, as you are pinning, you will stretch your neck band to fit the neckline. And what you can do to make sure that you are pinning the neckline evenly is you can find the side of your neckband by placing the center front and the center back together, and then find the side. And you can do that on both sides. And then you can take this section and pin it to the shoulder seam. And you can do the same thing on the other side. And then that way, when you are pinning your neckband, you will know where you will need to stretch. Okay, I have pinned the entire neckband onto the neckline. Now we're gonna go to the sewing machine and we're gonna sew a 3/8 inch seam all the way around. Okay, I have my fabric aligned at the 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm gonna start near the center back seam. Okay, so I have gone around the entire neckline and I've pressed the seam allowance flat. Now, before I turn the seam allowance down toward the shirt and press the neckband out away from the garment, I'm going to clip in the corner. I'm going to clip a notch into the corner. And the reason I'm doing that is to prevent puckering in the seam allowance when I turn it out. So when we turn this out, to press it, you see how the seam allowance curves up? You see how that curves up when we turn it up? To prevent that, we're gonna clip in a notch. So let's lay this flat. And right in this corner is where we're gonna clip the notch. And you wanna clip up to, but not through your stitching. Okay, so now when we turn out our neckband and turn it on the curve, we have the neckband or the seam allowance spreading so that we're not getting that puckering, it's not turning up. So you want to do that on all 4 of your curves around the neckline. And then you will turn your neckband out away from your bodice, and you're going to press it flat. And you want to do that around the entire neckline. And then we're going to go to the machine and we're going to top stitch our seam allowance down onto the neckline. Okay, I'm using my Baby Lock Euphoria cover stitch machine to top stitch the neckline. If you are using a twin needle, you will do the same thing that I'm doing. I've removed one of my needles because I'm going to do a narrow cover stitch. So what you're going to do is line up your needles, your twin needles if you're using that, making sure that the needle will catch the edge of your seam allowance on the inside. Okay, so I have mine lined up. If you want to learn how to use a cover stitch machine, then I have a video here on my YouTube channel. You can click on the link above, or you can check the link in the description box. So I have my left needle lined up with the edge of my fabric, my seam allowance, and I know that because this notch here aligns with my left needle. So I have it aligned, and we're just going to stitch all the way around the perimeter of our neckline. Okay, after you have completed your neckline, this is what it will look like. If you will not be adding sleeves to your dress, you will sew your armhole bands on the same way that we sewed the neckband on, and then you will be ready to move on to the next step. If you are adding sleeves to your dress, then that's what we're going to do right now. Okay, to construct our sleeve, we have two pieces. We have a sleeve front and a sleeve back. And you will know the pieces, you will be able to tell them apart because one, the sleeve front is more narrow than the sleeve back. And also on the sleeve front, you have a single notch, and on the sleeve back, you have double notches. So what we're gonna do, you should have transferred 2 dots onto your pattern if you will be sewing the sleeve from view B. I will be sewing the sleeve from view B with the ties. So we need to have that opening because I've created the tie. I'm going to show you how to do this, and we need to have an opening to insert the tie through. So there are 2 markings that you should have transferred onto your pattern. I've also finished off the raw edge of my center, or the center where we're going to attach or sew these 2 together because I want a nice clean finish. Again, if you don't want to, you don't really need to do that because your knit fabric will not fray. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to pin these 2 together, the front, and place it with the right side facing up. We're going to take the back and place it on top, right sides facing each other, and we're just going to pin those. And I'm going to insert a pin where the dot is. And then I'm going to place another pin. We're going to sew from the bottom edge of the sleeve up to that first pin, and we're going to back stitch. Then we're going to move the needle over to the next pin, and we're going to start our sewing back stitch and then sew all the way up to the top of the sleeve. So let's go to the machine. Okay, I'm going to sew up to the first dot. And then I'm going to back stitch. Then we're going to slide our fabric down to the next dot. If your machine does not have an automatic thread cutter, then just use your little nippers or your scissors to cut away the thread. And then we're going to make sure we're aligning the needle with that next dot. So use your hand wheel to turn it down and make sure that it's hitting right where that dot is. And then we're going to continue sewing, starting with a back stitch. And back stitch. Okay, now you're going to take your scissors, your nippers, and cut away your threads, and then you're going to go to your pressing station and you need to press your seam allowances open. Okay, I have pressed the seam allowance open and I have my opening here for the ties. And I've also interfaced the hem edge of the sleeve, and I cut a strip 5/8 of an inch wide and just measured with the interfacing up to the seam on both sides and just fuse that onto the fabric. Now at this point, what I would normally do is attach the sleeve to the bodice flat and with the flat method, but I totally forgot, and so the seam together on the bodice. I sewed the side seams together. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to sew the underarm seam on the sleeve, and then we will attach our sleeve to the bodice with the inset method. So we're going to pin this together, and then we will finish off the seam allowance and then insert the sleeve into the bodice. Okay, we're going to begin and end with a back stitch starting at the bottom of the sleeve. Okay, now we're going to finish off the seam allowance and press your seam allowance toward the back of the sleeve. So the sleeve back, you want to press your seam allowance in that direction. Okay, I have pressed my seam allowance toward the sleeve back. Now we're going to fold up our hem using the edge of the interfacing as a guide. Okay, I'm gonna insert my sleeve onto the seam roll and making sure that the edge of the interfacing is along the fold you're going to press. Then you will continue pressing around the entire sleeve. After that, you will top stitch from the front of your sleeve using the same method that you used when you sewed in the hem on your skirt. And then we will be ready to insert the sleeve onto the bodice. Okay, I have my bodice with the wrong side facing out, and we're gonna go ahead and insert our sleeve. So we want to make sure that we are working with the correct sleeve. So you want to take a look at the notch. So this is the single notch. So this is the front of the bodice. And we want to make sure that we're inserting the sleeve with the single notch. So this is how the sleeve is going to go in. We want to make sure that this side is the single notch. So when I look at this, it's the double notch. So that's the wrong sleeve. So I'm going to bring the other one over. And we're going to take the single notch and line it up with the notch on the front of the bodice. So I'm going to insert the sleeve inside the bodice. Make sure I line up the side seam on the bodice with the underarm seam on the sleeve. And then I'm going to go and line up the notches on the back of the sleeve and the bodice. And at the top where the shoulder seam is, I'm going to align that with the center seam on the sleeve. Okay, now that we have those 4 points pinned, we're going to go around and continue pinning. So what I want to show you is how you can ease the sleeve into the bodice without having to sew the basting stitches, the 2 rows of basting stitches, and then pulling up the gathers to fit it in. So I'm going to show you what I do. So you can see that the sleeve is longer than the bodice. So what I will do is I'm going to take the center here of this sleeve curve on this side. I'm going to take the center and I'm going to press it into the center of the bodice. And then the extra, you see how that sleeve is curving out? I'm going to take the center of that and I'm going to press it in to where it falls on the bodice, and then pin. And I'm doing the same thing here. I'm going to take the center of that curve and press it to the bodice. Wherever it falls, you want to make sure that it's going straight onto the bodice.
and not sideways. And then you can continue doing this, but because we're working with knit, we can actually stretch the two pieces until it fits together. Okay, if you were working with a woven fabric, you couldn't do that. You would have to continue with inserting the pins. But at this point, you can stretch that to fit. And you will continue that all the way around, and then you will be able to, like you see here, there's still a little extra on the sleeve. You don't need to insert all those pins, because when you go to the sewing machine, when you're stitching, you can actually stretch the bodice a little bit so that the sleeve is fitting in. So continue pinning. You want to do the same thing on the other side. So this is what my bodice looks like with the sleeve pinned all the way around. Okay, now when we go to the sewing machine, I'm going to start at the underarm seam and stitch all the way around. You will continue stitching and just stretch your bodice a bit to make sure that your sleeve is fitting in flat. And when you come upon the seam allowance or the seam here at the shoulder, you want to make sure that your seam underneath, your seam allowances underneath are flat. Make sure they're lying flat. And backstitch. Okay, if you are leaving your seam allowances raw, then go ahead and insert a second row of stitching all the way around, and then you will trim close to the second row of stitching. If you are using a serger, then you can finish off your seam allowance with your serger, and then you're going to press your allowance toward the sleeve. Okay, we have our sleeves installed now, and the seam allowance is pressed toward the sleeve. Okay, now we're going to sew together our ties. So you're going to take your tie and you're going to place it with the right side facing up and fold over with the right sides facing, making sure that you are aligning the raw edges. We're just going to pin that. Then we're going to go to the machine and we're going to sew a stitch from one end all the way over, and we're going to stop at some point. You can decide where you want to stop, and you're going to leave about 1 to 2 inches of an opening so that we can turn it right side out. So when you reach the point where you want to stop, you're going to back stitch and then start again and sew to the end. It's the same method that we used to sew the opening for our sleeve. Okay, we will be sewing a 3/8 inch seam allowance for the ties. Okay, I'm going to back stitch. I'm going to slide the fabric down about 1.5 inches to 2 inches and continue sewing. Back stitch. Okay, next you're going to trim away about half of your seam allowance. I would leave about 1/8 inch at least. And after you have done that, you will turn your tie right side out using the opening that we left. Turn it right side out, and then you're going to go to your pressing station and give it a good press. Okay, just a quick tip. When you are trimming away the seam allowance on your tie, make sure that you leave the seam allowance in between the opening. That way, when you turn the tie right side out, you will have something to fold to the inside. After you have finished pressing your tie, then you can go back and you can either sew this with a hand needle, sew it closed, or you can leave it open, because once we insert it into the sleeve, we're going to knot it so this won't be coming apart. So it's up to you how you want to handle that. And here's another quick tip. When you turn your tie right side out, you can use your point turner to get nice sharp points on the end. So you would insert your point turner inside, and using the point, you will just push out that tip in the corner, which will give you a nice point at the end. And then you will do that on both sides. And then when you go to press your tie, make sure that you are folding it right along the fold. Make sure it's folded along the fold, and then press it. Okay, so I have my skirt on the table with the right side facing out, and we are looking at the skirt front. So we're going to take our bodice, and I have the wrong side facing out, and this is the bodice front. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn this upside down, and I'm going to feed the skirt through the opening at the neckline. So you have the 2 notches on the front of the bodice and then 2 notches on the front of the skirt. So we're going to line those up and pin in place. And then you're going to do the same thing at the back. You're going to make sure that center back seam is aligned first. And then we're going to go over to the side seam and the other side seam. And then you will continue around the entire skirt, pinning your bodice onto the skirt. And then we'll go to the machine and sew 1 stitch all the way around. Okay, after trying on your dress, and if you decide that you do want to insert elastic, then what you're going to do is go to your sewing machine, and you're going to take your seam allowance, and you're going to start at one end and sew all the way around. Make sure you're using your zigzag or your stretch stitch on your machine, because you need this seam to stretch along with the elastic. So sew from one end all the way around, and when you come back, make sure that you're leaving about 1 to 2 inches of an opening, and then you will take your elastic and insert it and feed it through the opening. After you've done that, come back and close this up. I will not be demonstrating that on the machine because I'm not inserting elastic on for my dress. If you are not adding elastic to your dress and you are leaving your seam allowance raw, then you can just go ahead and trim off the excess and press your seam up toward the bodice. Same thing if you are using a serger, or if you're doing a zigzag stitch or any other type of finish, then you will finish off your seam allowance and press it toward the bodice of your dress. And then you will be done, and the only thing left to do is to insert the ties into the opening, and I'll show you how we're going to do that right now. Okay, here's our sleeve, here's our tie, we have our opening, so we're going to take our tie and insert it through the opening. And then we're just going to tie a knot. And you can just play around with it until you get the look that you want. Okay, and now our tie is attached and we are done with our dress.
Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have enjoyed this video. If so, make sure you hit the like button down below, and I hope you will have fun sewing your dress. And please, if you are on Instagram and you share pictures of your dress, make sure that you tag me at Anita by Design. If you're on Facebook, then you can send me a picture through private message. I would love to see your makes, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.